Thanks everyone for coming. What I want to do here is something that's fairly simple, at least off the start. This is really going to be focused on how to start, how to set up the hosting for a podcast. So let's imagine that you've already recorded some things, you've created some artwork, and you've got all the pieces in place. But what I've found is a lot of people are into some friction about, well, how do I actually get it set up? It feels like a very techie kind of thing to do. So how do you actually set up the hosting, which then gets distributed to all the podcast apps and so on? So that's a bit what we're actually going to do this here in a couple minutes. And I mean, it should take about 10 to 15 minutes. Really, once you know what to do, then it's not a terribly long process. Then we'll see how much time we have, of course. If you have any other questions, really about anything, if you want to talk about podcast distribution or setting up audio files or anything else like that, we can certainly do some of that too. But I really want to focus on this in particular. So you may be familiar, we talk about hosting and there's, well, who's the host? I mean, there's the person who's the host of the show, but really when we talk about podcast hosting service, we're talking about an online website where you actually put your files, where you set up the podcast. And that includes everything, the name, the title, the email, and everything, and it starts from there. And why is that important? Because that's what distributes your files, your actual episodes, out to all the various apps. And that's how people find your show. If you didn't use a podcast host, the only really other option is you could maybe put the files on your website if you have a website host, but they're not set up for any of that. They don't have the same kind of bandwidth. You'd be paying a fortune to do that, and it's not designed for that. That's why we have podcast hosting companies nowadays, and it makes it very easy to set it up. They're really designed for this. You get the RSS feed, which is the little code that gets distributed to all the apps, and they give you the metadata, the tags, and so on, statistics. It's all really set up here in the podcast hosting. Now, today we're going to do something that's free, and there are some free options. Of course, then you get into the paid level where you get more options and advanced statistics and things like that. But there are at least a couple free hosting services. You've probably heard of Spotify for podcasting, which is the actual hosting service for podcasters. It used to be known as Anchor. Spotify bought it out. That is one option. It's fairly bare bones. And so what I recommend, and what we're going to do today, is set up a podcast on Podbean. Podbean is another podcast hosting service. And they have a pretty good free option. You get some statistics. They'll do all the full distribution. And the real key thing with this, if you were to do this yourself, is that when you're ready, your show's growing, you want more statistics, more options, you just start paying for the plan. You just upgrade to their paid plan, which is something like $10 to $12 a month. Really, it's not that bad. But because you're already set up there, you just do that automatic upgrade. And it's a good service. So we're going to do this with Podbean. And the real... Podbean, yeah. I'll put it back up on screen here. It's Yep, and I'll show you the website in a second. And we're actually doing this with an actual podcast that we're recording this weekend, the Camp Indie Pop-Up Podcast. We're slowly piecing together little bits and pieces of audio. I do have a little clip that Sharon recorded today. So when you guys get home, and myself too, after the camp is over, I'm going to piece all these little clips together. And this actual podcast that you'll hear in a few days is what we're setting up right now. So you're going to see how this all works. Okay, so I'm going to flip back and forth between a couple screens here. But first, what we're going to do is go to Podbean. This is the Podbean website, podbean.com. And we're going to create a new profile. Now, I have set all this up ahead of time, but you can do that yourself. So you need a name for the account. A Camp Indie Pop-Up Podcast is the name of your account. The email address, again, you can set all this up ahead of time. You can use your own. You can set up a dedicated email for your podcast if you want to kind of keep things separate. Camp Indie Pop-Up Podcast at gmail.com, and create a password and create an account. Now, Podbean's great because right away they're going to say, do you want to bring in an existing podcast or are you setting up a brand new one? Well, we're setting up a new one. So we'll go to create new podcast. And then they're going to really walk you through the steps of what to do. So the first thing here is called go to setup. And first you're going to give it a title. Now I'm just going to rename this to Camp Indie Pop-Up Podcast. That's going to be the podcast title. And next you want to add the description. Now the podcast description is when you're opening a podcast in probably on your phone and you're looking at the overall description of what the podcast is about. So not a specific episode, but what the actual podcast is about. And that's something, it's generally a couple paragraphs or so. It's good to stick in a few keywords, the type of things people are searching for. It often can be indexed, so it's important to do some of that. So you can get that ready, and I'm going to copy that over into Podbean.
Is more better?
Not too long, I would say. Podbean's a good example. They say there's a limit of 50,000 characters, which is quite long. You don't need anything near that much, because think about it, you're on your phone, you're not going to scroll down through all these big long descriptions. So you want something that's, fairly catchy, fairly pointy within the first kind of 2 or 3 paragraphs. Is really about all you need. Okay, the next category, the next component to this is the category. So all podcasts are placed into various topics and themes and categories. Most of this comes from Apple Podcasts, who really originated a lot of this idea, and they've come up with these kind of arbitrary categories. So you really kind of have to fit your show into where you think it fits best. Now ours is a little kind of, I'm not really sure what to call it. Is it a business podcast? Not so much. Maybe, what else they got here? Social, culture. Religion, yeah. Society and culture. Here you go. Sometimes you see surveys and statistics, and they're like, what's the most popular category, broadly speaking, for a podcast? The vast majority are society and culture, because it really encompasses a whole bunch of things. So I'm choosing that too, because, what else are you really going to do? But they do give you a couple other options. So I could add, maybe I'll stick business in as just a subcategory, and it just increases some of your searchability. If people are searching for business podcasts, they may not be thinking it would be something like this, but we don't exclusively talk about business, of course, but it's part of the theme. So I'll add that in as a category, and you can change all of this stuff after you've launched the show. All of this is customizable, and you can update it, and it just gets reset in the feed. Okay, the next thing you need to do is add your cover art. Now, I've done this ahead of time. Again, if you have all this stuff ready, then you're just kind of pulling it up and have a little bit of cover art. Now, let's make sure it's the right size. There's lots of resources out there for cover art. Probably the go-to is Canva, and they have all kinds of templates. It's great. They make it the right size. And I don't want to get too into the techie details, but essentially, it's, that's a good example. They're telling me my file size here is too big. Because the cover art I had was 3.69 megabytes. So I'm going to have to resize this. Let's see here. Save as a JPEG. That'll make it smaller. So a good example how these programs will usually remind you about stuff like this if it doesn't fit in with their formatting. Make sure I get in the right place here. Okay. All right, I'm going to choose my JPEG file this time. There it is. Good. That was 437 kilobytes, so perfect size. Okay, and then I'll add that to the feed. Now that's pretty much it. Now we're almost set. I mean, they get some advanced options. Again, all this is free. You haven't paid a dime. We're not going to pay for this podcast. It's all free. And this is what is included with Podbean, for example. So it's already plugged in, the copyright stuff, the language. You can change all that, of course, if you want. You can change the time. We're going to set this maybe to Eastern time. Probably a good idea. And there it is. It's saved. So now Podbean is directing us to the next and what should be the final step. You can't publish a podcast and start getting it distributed until you do the last component. You have to have a piece of audio. even if it's like 30 seconds long. You have to have that, or the RSS feed won't be ready to be distributed. So we did put together a little piece of audio from today, and I'm going to add that. And again, it just tells you here, choose a file to upload. Here's another thing. Podbean wants me to confirm. I've set up a brand new podcast. I need to confirm if that's the case. Okay, I am not a robot. There we go.
Which picture has it?
I'm glad I didn't do that. Okay, now I should be able to upload a file. Yep. And let's find where it is. Episodes. This is our demo episode. Okay. It's uploading my MP3 file right now. Now we get into the actual details of this episode. So I do need to give it a title. I'm just going to call this one Episode 1. And then you get into the description. Now, this is probably a more common thing when you're listening to podcasts and it's on your phone. You choose an episode, but really you're choosing whether you want to listen to a certain episode. Part of that is in the title. You want to have a decent title. This is not, but at least it's just a temporary placeholder. And then you'd like to have some kind of description that explains, what the episode is about, if you have a guest, what you're going to learn, maybe a bit of a cliffhanger, kind of a hook to get people to click play and learn more. Well, I'm just going to do the opposite of that and say this is our first episode. But because I don't want to dwell on that right now, and the reason is we can always come back and fix this stuff later and update it. That's it. It's a full episode. It's clean. Sometimes you see podcasts or even specific episodes that have a little E if it's explicit, and you can choose to add that. In this case, of course, it's fine. And publish. Publish now. Okay, that's it. This podcast is now live. It's out there to the world. Now, no one's going to really find it unless they go to Podbean and the specific website that comes with this hosting to listen to it. Because, actually, I'm going to go back to my little checklist here. So, we opened a new account with Podbean. We added our components. The email address was the first thing. We had the title for the podcast. We added the description, chose the categories. We added the cover art. The last step there, we added an audio file. And as it stands right now, there is an RSS feed. It's a live podcast, but it's not being distributed. So with podcasts, there's really two major distribution services, Apple Podcasts and Spotify itself, which is different from hosting it with Spotify. It's the Spotify that distributes it. When you open the Spotify app, then it will be displayed there. Same with Apple. A lot of you probably listen to podcasts maybe on third-party apps that's not Apple, that's not an iPhone, that's not Spotify. Maybe you have another app that you like to use. The vast, virtually all of those apps are pulling their data from Apple Podcasts, and that's important, which means we have to make sure our new podcast here is set up, is connected, and distributed to Apple, and then Apple will send it on to all those other podcast apps. So to do that, we need to go to Apple Podcast Connect, which is here. Now, I've already logged in. This is a little bit of a longer step, and I've kind of skirted around it a bit here, because if you don't already have an Apple account, just a blanket Apple account for music and all movies and all that kind of stuff, then you have to set that up first. And that could take a bit of time. You have to do like security confirmation and all this kind of stuff. So now I've avoided that step, obviously for the sake of time. I've already logged in. But once you're logged into Apple Podcast Connect, it's easy to find. Just search for Apple Podcast Connect, and you log in. It's a plus button here. Two options. You can add a new channel if you already have a show, but we have a new show. We're going to add the new show. And let's see what they ask us to do. Add a show with an RSS feed. Good. That's what we have. I'm going to go back to Podbean. And we want to go to distribution. Should be in here. Move me over there. Settings. Feed. RSS feed. So the RSS feed, this is where all the data that we've just added is saved. Your cover art's in there, your email address, your name, description, everything. Every time you add a new episode to your podcast, to your show, it gets embedded in this RSS feed, and there's little like bots that are trolling from Apple and these other apps that'll recognize, usually within an hour or so, that you have some new information, and they pick it up and distribute it. So to set this up with Apple itself, we're going to need to copy this, go back to Podcast Connect, paste in the feed. This should work. Okay, so they're showing me the show information. This is a draft right now. This does not contain third-party content. No. I don't have to add contact info unless I want to. And I'm going to click Save, see what happens. This step can be a little slow. It says they're still processing show details, so I had a feeling that would happen. Apple Podcast Connect can take a bit of time. I've done this sometimes, and it can be there within a couple hours. I've heard stories where it can take 2 or 3 days or more. So we'll see what happens. But we know that it is submitted at least to Apple, and we'll just keep checking, logging in here to make sure that the show is there. Once it's there, then you kind of see the same information that you see in Podbean itself, in your actual hosting place. You'd have the information, your description, and your host, the name, and your name and email and all that kind of stuff. And that's going to go out to all the apps. So we've done it with Apple. Let's go back to my checklist here. The next one's Spotify itself, to set up the same basic process on Spotify to make sure that they're also picking up the RSS feed and going into the Spotify. Because it's something like, I think about 30%, they say, of podcast listeners worldwide listen to podcasts on Spotify. It's been going quite a bit. So it's important to make sure your podcast is there. Let's see here. Yep, there it is. So same thing, I already logged into Spotify just to get a step ahead. I already have a podcast, same idea. So I'm going to go here. It should ask me to just add the RSS feed. There it is. Good, it's already saved. It's thinking about it. Oh, that's interesting. It's missing an email address. Let's see. This is a security feature. I've noticed it's good with a lot of these podcast hosts, is that you do need to have an email address that's connected to your account, but a lot of the spam bots have learned to latch onto this, and so you'll start getting random spam to that email because it's in this RSS feed, which is kind of public information. So the podcast hosts have got around that by saying that you can kind of unlock the email address, make it visible for about 24 hours so that you can do the Spotify distribution and other places too. And after 24 hours, it goes back to being private again, so you won't get that spam. So I think that's what's happening here. I'll update that. It might take a few minutes really to go through, but you get the idea. So basically, it's the same thing with Spotify. Once that clears through, then this would say that the feed is valid. It'll show up in Spotify. And again, our podcast that we just set up will be ready to go. And I think it's already starting to find it. Like Spotify has found this podcast. It's over here on the right. That's the artwork. And so it's pretty close to doing it. This is good. Okay. So the last thing I'll really show you, which is kind of the final step, is to make sure that other distribution is in place. Distribution, again, is taking the podcast from beyond just Podbean and your host and sending it out to other apps as well. So we've done Apple. We're going to have to wait on that. Spotify, we're waiting on that. Maybe we'll do one more at least. I mean, it takes a few minutes, but it's kind of rinse and repeat. You just copy the RSS feed. Let's do Amazon, because I know some people listen to it on Amazon too. Most of these podcast hosts, and I should point out again, you don't have to use Podbean by any means. It's free. That's why we're using it now. But there's lots of other services. There's Buzzsprout and there's Libsyn and some of these names you may have heard of if you've done some podcast research. They're all basically the same. They have different kind of prices, different packages, but they're the same basic format. You add all those same components, you get your RSS feed, and you set up your distribution. And they'll always walk you through the steps here too. So this is great. They're giving us a checklist to make sure we have our title, description, category. There's an audio file there. I'll click next. And these guys will actually submit the RSS feed automatically to Amazon. That's great. I don't have to log into Amazon. I don't have to create some Amazon podcast account or anything like that. Podbean has gone ahead and done that for me. So click the button. Apple doesn't do that. Spotify sometimes. That's why we have to do it manually. But all these others, it'll do it through the program, through Podbean, and again, these other hosts will do that too. So you can see some others here. I mean, there's iHeartRadio, and honestly, I mean, the statistics is like maybe 0.5% of listeners actually use a lot of these apps here. So it's not a priority to set that up. I'm not going to do it now. The vast majority are Apple and Spotify, and maybe Amazon too. Well, that's basically it. I mean, now we play the waiting game. This is partly why I could share you the link to Podbean, to that first little episode that I uploaded. You could listen to it now directly through the site. You're not going to find it yet on Apple and Spotify. If you come back within 48 hours, it'll be there. And then we're going to have more stuff, of course, over the next few days. But basically, that's it. This podcast is live. So we went from 0 to this in about 15 minutes? Not too bad. So I know it's a lot all at once, and I'm going to share all these links here and that little checklist and things you can refer back to afterwards. But if you get those components in place, again, that's the fundamental thing. You're going to have an email address one way or another, the title for your show. You write a quick description, choose a category, make a quick cover art in Canva, it's a good example, and then add a piece of audio, and that's it. That's how you set up a podcast. So, yeah.